Hello and welcome to Encounters. My guest today is a very important person, very influential by Forbes magazine standards, one of the 7 most important influential women in the world, they say. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean the richest women in the world, but Dr. Vandana Shiva will explain what the difference is about, I guess. Dr. Shiva started as a physicist and has become a very good one in the Indian context, but gradually you also added a more social justice kind of component to what you were doing, right? And that of course has caught the attention of many people in the world, including some who make awards, and one of the very prestigious awards you received already in 1993 was the Right Livelihood Award, which is by certain standards called the Alternative Nobel Prize. And just recently, in 2010, you got the City of Sydney Peace Prize, which is also, I know, an important award, especially in the Australian and Pacific context. But what you're even more famous for is the movement you started, the Nandanja movement, which has quite a bit of following these days and stands for a lot of very noble and very important principles. So where did it all start for you, given that you at one point were only interested in education and teaching and research, I guess?
Yes, and I thought I would have a very simple life of a physicist, nothing beyond the psi function and quantum theory. Mm-hmm. There are really 3 steps that have brought me into the work that I do now. The first was my involvement with the Chipko movement as a student. And the Chipko movement is the original tree-hugging movement where women of my region, the Himalaya, said, you'll have to kill us before you kill the tree, we'll hug the trees. And it took 10 years, but by 1981, they succeeded in getting a logging ban and succeeded in changing the thinking about the forest, that forests were not just timber mines, they were the sources of water and soil and pure air. That made me an ecological activist, also educated me on the connection between social justice and ecological sustainability, that the 2 are not separate. Mm-hmm. They've been made to look separate from the top down. Right. Especially from the point of view of capitalist patriarchy. Right. That you can either have economy or you can have ecology, when both are rooted in the same word, oikos. The second big wake-up call for me was really 1984, not George Orwell's 1984, but in a way an exposure of another doublespeak, the doublespeak of the Green Revolution, which got a Nobel Peace Prize for creating peace through chemicals, when the chemicals came from war. Yeah, you're very critical about that. Yeah, and the reason I was forced to become critical was we had the Bhopal disaster and we had the rise of terrorism. If there was a Bin Laden that the Americans were afraid of, there was a Bhindarwale that Indira Gandhi became afraid of and eventually hounded him down in the Golden Temple. Right. And 30,000 people died in Punjab, 30,000 people died in Bhopal. And I had to understand why had agriculture become like war. That's when I started to study agriculture. Right. And I can tell you, I thought I did a very tough PhD thesis on non-locality in quantum theory. But the way agriculture has evolved is even more complicated, because there's nothing natural about it. Mm-hmm. There's nothing just about it. There's nothing true about it. It's all lies and distortions and exploitation and manipulation in layers that are so heavy to reveal. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. And just by the time I'd started figuring it out and wrote my book called The Violence of the Green Revolution and started to get invited to conferences, you had the same guys who sold us the war chemicals as pesticides and fertilizers, now selling us genetic engineering and saying we are inventors of life, we will therefore own life forms through patenting. And that's the day I decided, we've got to save the seed, got to save freedom for the life forms of this planet. Navdanya started out of that urge for freedom. You at one point called it eco-piracy, right? Yes, and when I talked about biopiracy and eco-piracy, I kind of anticipated that it could happen, given a worldview where corporations thought they were owners of life on the planet, and then we actually had to fight cases.
Yeah, and two of the cases I recall are the challenges you experienced with neem as the product and basmati, which we normally associate with rice. Can you explain that a bit?
Well, you know, when I started to work on Bhopal, at that point I started a campaign called No More Bhopals, Plant a Neem. And 10 years later I find the neem is patented.
Right.
And a company called W.R. Grace, which destroyed the water outside Boston, Massachusetts, by putting its toxic waste into the groundwater. And it's only when the mothers of the children who were getting leukemia started to do their own tests, they realized that there was dumping going on. And actually, an author from this area wrote a book called A Civil Action, which became a film. Well, W.R. Grace claimed to have invented the use of neem for pest control in agriculture, and the US government, Department of Agriculture, joined them in a joint patent. That was one of the many patents. All they did was piracy, because we've used neem for centuries.
Right.
So we challenged this case, and I joined with the European Greens and the International Federation of Organic Agriculture Movements. We fought the case for 11 years, but we won. And the decision of the overturning of that patent after the appeal came to us on an 8th of March, and we were 3 women fighting this case for 11 years. So it is a wonderful gift.
Right.
Basmati was 98, and a company in Texas claimed to have invented the Basmati. The Basmati means the queen of aroma, and Dehradun, my valley, is the most famous for the original Basmati. Our Basmati elongates to twice the length and, of course, has tremendous aroma. Rice Tech thought you just put tech on rice and you can steal Thailand's jasmine rice and call it Jasmati, and India's Basmati and call it Basmati, and no, call it Texmati as a trade name. But they also had a patent on it. So we took that case on, and it took a lot of innovation on our part. I filed a case in the Supreme Court of India and said we fought the neem case, but it shouldn't be left to us to defend the national heritage, both the biological heritage as well as the intellectual heritage. But we also challenged in the US Patent Office, and we built up a huge campaign in the United States of citizens here, which said hands off the Basmati to Rice Tech, and to the US Patent and Trademark Office, which is USPTO, a major postcard campaign saying if you don't get this patent struck down, we will have to name you the US Piracy and Theft Office, the office that facilitates piracy. And by the end of it, the US Patent and Trademark Office had to strike that patent down. We fought a third case, which was Monsanto taking a patent on a low gluten wheat from India. And in that case, we didn't even have to fight the case at the US, at the European Patent Office. They withdrew, having seen the record of the fact that the piracy fights that we had fought, we had won, so they withdrew the patent. But these are only 3 cases that we took up and fought. Hundreds of thousands of biopiracy cases are there. There are 1,500 cases of patents taken by 5 big gene giants on all the climate resilience crops that the world has. And India has a lot of them. We have rices that can tolerate salt, floods, drought, and without doing anything, they're just taking patents. They've taken thousands of patents on herbal medicine. And the tactic is a dual tactic. You make it illegal for farmers to save their own seed through intellectual property rights. You make it illegal for people to process their own food. You're now making it illegal for people to have herbal medicine. I know laws have been passed in Europe, in Canada. And then what remains, you patent it. So they want a world of monopoly where everything is privatized, including this planet.
Yeah, and unfortunately they are winning in a number of important cases, but thanks to your movement and what is called the anti-globalization movement, the steps to compete it are becoming much more powerful and mobilizing a lot of additional people. Now, what I find interesting in the way you have approached this, and also in your writings, is that you always make the connection between what is happening in nature to what is happening in society, the role of people, the way people are treated or mistreated, and especially women in that regard. So it's a much more holistic approach than what you normally find in the environmental movement, but it also needs some kind of direction. And what kind of direction do you want to give it, or you see?
Well, you know, when we started building the movement against globalization, one of the things that was repeatedly said was the anti-globalization movement knows what it's against, but it doesn't know what it's for, which wasn't true. If we were fighting against patents on life, it's because we were for the integrity of species and their sovereignty. If we were fighting against so-called free trade, which is unfree trade, it's because we were for fair trade. So it isn't that we were blindly critiquing an unjust system. We knew what justice is, and we were building movements for justice and sustainability and peace. So I decided at a certain point to articulate the alternative that inspired us and guided us. And I framed it as Earth democracy. That we are part of the Earth. That's the first thing we forgot, and that's where things started to go wrong. We are part of the Earth community. And not only does that mean that we are not separate from nature, it also means that all humans have equal rights to the gifts and bounties and abundance of nature, equal rights to the water. Therefore, privatizing water is ecologically wrong, it's ethically wrong and morally wrong, and it's unjust. Similarly, the air, to be equally shared. And it's wrong to pollute and destroy the climate, but it's doubly wrong for the polluters to appropriate the climate and say, now we will trade in pollution and make more money out of continuing to pollute, whilst others don't pollute on our behalf. I call this the indulgences. You know, the Catholic Church ruined itself by saying, you can continue to sin, just give us a few indulgences. So we make money and you continue to sin and everyone's living happily ever after. But you know, carbon trading, emissions trading is of similar quality. And we are now reaching a burst of thinking on the part of corporations who would like to commodify the last drop of water, the last gene in the rainforest, the last capacity of ecosystems to provide services. They can only think through money. And therefore, when it comes to recognizing the value of nature, for them there's no other value but money and price and trade and commerce. And that's going to be the big fight over the next 2-3 years. But the rights of nature, in my view, are actually the foundation of human rights. And that's why this new movement of articulating the rights of Mother Earth that grew out of Bolivia, and I'm part of the core group that the Bolivian government has picked to move this into the United Nations, and the General Assembly just had a session on harmony with nature, which was so refreshing, such a breath of fresh air in that huge bureaucracy that doesn't know how to turn. Here was this totally new thought, a new seed being planted, that we should live in harmony with nature. It shouldn't be so difficult to think of living in harmony with nature, because if you don't accept that, what you're saying is disharmony with nature. And all the violence that's leading to climate change, species extinction, problem with water, all the ecological crisis we face. But for the poor, it means no water. It means no food. It means no home. It means no place to call their own. It means massive displacement. And one of the things that is preoccupying me a lot, both intellectually as well as in terms of support to movements on the ground, is that the same actors who brought down Wall Street and the financial system with their totally concocted instruments like derivatives and collateral debt obligations, and you just work out an instrument to make money. And after they sank the world and tanked the world, they're now grabbing the land of the poor as a secure investment. So you have a land grab in Africa, you have a land grab in India, you have a mineral grab, you have a resource grab, because the real stuff, including food, is where they want to have control while they still make money. But that's leading to hunger, it's leading to displacement, it is leading to tragedies and wars of a scale that even the great wars did not destroy.
Right, but yeah, I can follow you, but at the same time I think that it's also a matter of short-term and long-term kind of perspectives, and many of these multinationals and big corporations, and call also the Western governments as part of the problem, they are not interested in those long-term perspectives. So you need to create capacity to make it a global movement, as we probably agree. But how to do it, where to start? If you mentioned United Nations, which I think is an important part to have this all being discussed and negotiated, but it doesn't really start there. It starts at a more local level, I guess.
I think you have to do it at both levels. I think you have to do the global through the United Nations, just so the United Nations is not available to support the global resource grab and land grab. They lend themselves more to defending the rights of the earth and the rights of people. But it's also necessary that communities who are defending themselves, communities who are trying to create alternatives, link together in another network of consciousness. And I think that's happening. I don't think it's happening fast enough, and that's where we need to put our energies to accelerate it. I think the most important point is something I heard when I was in Wisconsin just before coming here to Massachusetts to visit my very dear friend Jean. In Wisconsin, they said, our problem is that the poorest people think they have no reason to fight because they've lost everything anyway.
Right.
And what I said was, they haven't realized they haven't lost anything compared to what they could lose. That there's lots to lose. If they lose a little bit of food security they get, a little bit of social security get, that will be taken away. And the elite who are privatizing all the public wealth and all the common wealth that should be our shared wealth, they have managed to convince the poorest that your real enemy is the level just above you.
Right.
That unionized worker, that university professor, that school teacher. And our challenge is to build the solidarity of the bottom. And the clarity that provides through human solidarity, through being one as human beings, rather than constantly be made to think through the abstracts of the market, the abstractions that the corporations create, where they make it look like if there are no public schools and no public educational institutions, everyone will be better off, rather than recognize that education will become the privilege of a thin minority.
Yes, but at the same time, I think you also have to put it in a cultural context. And if we stay with this country, it's not only that the system seems to indicate that you'll have to compete with your immediate superior, but that you can only blame yourself for your failure. And so the idea of a self-made person is still very much around and doesn't really lead to empowerment and collaboration.
And that's precisely why the recovery of a sense of community becomes so important, not just the human community, but the earth community. And I don't think we will recover our human community spirit without re-embedding ourselves in the earth community. Because it's only when we enlarge our consciousness to realize we are human beings on this beautiful planet, which provides us everything. And we can be poor because it was taken away. We can be landless because land was taken away, as for the Native Americans it has been. As for today's peasants and tribals in India, it's being alienated just so we can have more highways, more factories, more mines. I think community is the place for liberation and freedom. And community can't be taught as an abstract idea. It can be experienced and lived through solidarity and mutual support.
So can you give me a couple of examples of how this can be initiated or how it has been developed?
Well, I think the place where I started building Navdanya is an example where we said seeds belong to the community. They aren't the property and creation of Monsanto. And we will defend seed as a common good. We will create community seed banks. And by recovering the community, we defended our freedom. I think every place in the world where water privatization has been fought, it has been fought not by pitting individuals against a corporation, but by pitting the community and the sense of water as a commons and a public good against the privatization of the corporation. And that's true in the United States, and it is true in India, where we stopped the privatization of Delhi's water supply under pressure of the World Bank by Suez, the world's biggest water privatizer. And I have a feeling that even when it comes to the earth itself and her amazing web of life and her ecological processes that hold it all together, I don't think those who want to fragment this earth and commodify it and commercialize every function are going to win the hearts and minds of the people. I think it's the love for the earth and the love for the interconnectedness of the universe that is going to be the inspiration that will create the next paradigm for our life on this planet.
Yeah, I'm with you, but at the same time I also see all these dangerous and troublesome things happening, like what we experienced some weeks ago in Japan, and which is probably more to come in regard to flooding and earthquakes, etc. And although there is definitely more awareness and willingness of communities to share and to mobilize, but the overwhelming power of those to compete with is such that you sometimes are fighting against the wall, so to speak.
Well, you know, I mean, Japan had its huge tragedies, including the unnecessary nuclear tragedy of the Fukushima reactor. But I think it was the community spirit of the Japanese that have allowed them to see themselves through the disaster. I was told the story of a 9-year-old boy who, when he was given food by a social worker and a rehabilitation worker out of line, he went and put that food at the beginning of the queue and said, "I'll wait for my turn." And I think that's what's been so impressive. The sense of sharing and caring by the victims of those triple disasters, the earthquake, the tsunami, and Fukushima. And we have a disaster in the making in India where on the day where the Chernobyl anniversary was being remembered with all seriousness, our Prime Minister said we will not stop building the world's biggest nuclear power plant in Jaitapur. And that power plant is being resisted by local people, and the resistance has gone stronger after Fukushima. Right. The movement is so strong, the police shot someone dead. A march from Tarapur to Jaitapur that I was part of, organizing, it was stopped. They weren't allowed to go. There's Section 44, which means you can't meet in that entire district where they want to build the nuclear power plant. Now, in my view, if nuclear power has to create dictatorship, then it's just not worth having in any case, because democracy is what we must uphold. And that our democracies are mutating into dictatorships with the impositions of more hazards, more vulnerability, is part of the conflict. Right. It's part of the contest we face. And it is true that those who want to make money are imposing more hazards, whether they be nuclear hazards or hazards of genetically modified foods and seeds. And it just means we have to work that much harder, and we have to put our energies that much stronger together.
Okay. In your writings and in your speeches, you also make reference to Mahatma Gandhi as a source of inspiration. Can you elaborate on that part? What is so important about the Gandhian perspective on all of this?
Well, you know, I of course grew up in a very Gandhian atmosphere. My mother was a Gandhian, and I remember in my 6th birthday, it must have been, she asked me what I want for my birthday, and all my friends were wearing nylon frocks. They were ugly when I look back at it, but you know, it was just the beginning of making fiber out of petrochemicals. They were ugly, ugly, ugly. So she, and she, you know, she could just have said, no, I won't get it to you. You wear the khadi, which was, you know, the handspun cloth that Gandhi brought back. And but she didn't just say no. She said, I'll get you the nylon frock, but just remember, when you buy a nylon frock, you're helping a millionaire get his next Mercedes. And if you wear a khadi frock, you are helping a poor woman feed her children that night, and you make your choice. So Gandhi kind of came to me very early in life. But the time where in the Chipko movement of it was a very Gandhian movement. But it's when I was hearing these corporations talk about genetically modifying and patenting every seed, my mind went to Gandhi and the spinning wheel. And I said, we've got to find the spinning wheel of today. And that's where I thought of the seed being today's spinning wheel. But the part of Gandhi that to me is so important in today's world, where corporate power and state power is converging, which is, according to Roosevelt, fascism, but those two converge. When we are in that situation, how do you get out of it? Gandhi gave us the path, and that path he called Satyagraha. Satyagraha means the fight for truth, the force of truth, soul force. And he basically said, when you are governed by unjust laws, it is your duty to not obey them so you can obey higher laws, the higher laws of our common humanity, the higher laws of our common ethics. And one of the ways in which we fight the patenting of life is basically declaring a satyagraha and saying, we will not recognize patents on life because it's degraded thinking. And we will recognize seeds as our commonwealth, and we will share them and save them and treat this as a major duty. It took Rosa Parks to just sit down in a bus to say, I will not obey these racist laws of denying blacks their place in a bus. It took civil disobedience to create every major freedom movement non-violently. And we really have only two choices before us in the face of a highly oppressive and closed system. Either you try to become violent, and that doesn't succeed, and in my view it's not ethically right, or you just say non-violently, I will not cooperate. That is something that can't be taken away from us.
No, indeed, it can't, but you need a movement to accomplish this.
You definitely need a movement. And again, we have two choices. Either the majority of people get treated like disposable waste of society and are allowed to turn against each other in the worst of criminal behavior, or we collectively rebuild society to share the gifts of the earth and to share the gifts of our labor in human solidarity within the limits of sustainability.
That's a nice way of putting it. By way of conclusion, may I, given that you are also a teacher and a leader in this regard, you're coming here to give a lecture at Amherst College later today. What's the role of education in all of this? And maybe in a negative sense, the struggle for the truth, as you pointed, we are fighting again a pretty powerful enemy with the mass media who are not really interested in the issues we consider important.
No, I think the tragedy with the mass media is it has become the biggest miseducator. More education takes place through the mass media, but most of the messages and content of the mass media is manipulating people's mind in order to have them adjust to the exploitation of their common good. And that is why we need real education. We need the bringing of truth to people. And part of the way I do that education is, of course, things like lectures at Amherst today, but we also run a school at our farm, which is like a learning center, but we give it the grand name of the Earth University. Because we believe it's in small places that alternatives will emerge. And as these alternatives emerge and spread, the false education or the non-education that people are being condemned to, that's the problem. You know, either you have good public institutions being dismantled, and it breaks my heart to see liberal education being replaced by 3 courses everywhere in the world, as if it's biotechnology and GMOs, management for profit making, and information technology, that are the 3 things humanity needs to survive on this planet. There's so many other skills that are being left out, and we do need to fill that gap one way or the other.
Thank you for your lecture today, and thank you for your interest.